On the Good Morning Artesia radio show, and it's good to have Michael Rebman back on with us from the Artesia Historical Museum and Art Center. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
Glad you could be with us today, and you told me the topic we want to talk about, the statehood process for New Mexico. New Mexico was founded a long time, or the territory, a long time before it became a state. Trying to remember when we became a state.
We became a state on January 6th, 1912.
1912, and I'm sure they didn't just wake up one morning in 1911 and say, let's make New Mexico a state. There was probably an interesting process that the state had to go through to ask to be admitted. So let's, where do we begin with this process?
Well, we begin by explaining how a state or how a territory becomes a state, because that's important for understanding what happens with New Mexico and why it took so long. So to become a state, a territory, of course, has to be organized as a territory. They have to lobby Congress to come up with an enabling act. And then the enabling act would set the expectations that Congress has for how the territory could organize into a state.
Mm-hmm.
So that would include requirements like settling border disputes of other territories, establishing where the territory's borders were, the timeline for when it needs to have a state constitution signed, and other such requirements. And once that is passed and signed by the president, then it is sent back to the territory, and the territory is expected to create and pass a state constitution.
Okay.
And once that happens, Congress then receives word of the state constitution, and then they just simply pass a joint resolution, both houses, that they turn over to the president to sign.
So that's the basic process, but there was a lot going on with the Civil War and Mexico and Texas, so I'm sure it wasn't a straightforward process. There was probably quite a bit of wrangling and stuff that went on prior to becoming a state.
Oh, there was a lot going on behind the scenes, but the things that were going on behind the scenes never surfaced to above the scenes, so kind of a weird phrase to say. So New Mexico, there were 5 attempts at creating a state. There was a lot of lobbying. Almost every year, the at-large territorial representative went to the Statehood and Territories Committee in the House of Representatives and asked for an enabling act. Almost every year that happened. Mm-hmm. But only 5 years they actually went beyond the committee to an actual vote. 1872, 1876, 1890, 1906, and finally 1910. The 1910 effort was successful.
Okay.
And this is all since 1850, when when New Mexico officially became a territory. So that's over the course of 62 years. So interestingly enough, the first time they tried to bring statehood to a vote, 1872, that failed. Not out of any sort of debate over how statehood would happen, but simply because the enabling act that the House of Representatives passed and the enabling act that the Senate passed did not match up, and they simply forgot to do, or they didn't care to do reconciliation to get them to match up. So the bill never passed and never was sent off to the president to sign.
Mm-hmm.
1876, it was voted down.
Okay.
1890, it was voted, it was approved, but the Constitution that the territory tried to pass failed.
So the territory didn't approve the Constitution?
Yes.
Okay.
In 1906 was a very strange one. the Senate and the House of Representatives decided that the best way for New Mexico to become a state would be if it merged with the territory of Arizona and became the state of Arizona. Which was President Roosevelt's idea.
Okay.
He thought that that New Mexico would best become a state if it was merged together like that. And interestingly enough, the proposed joint constitution passed in New Mexico, but failed in Arizona.
Okay.
It just barely passed in New Mexico, but it was like 80 to 20 voting down in Arizona. So that did not happen. And then finally, 1910, that's when the Enabling Act was passed. But it wasn't until January 1912. It took a little over a year for the Constitution to be written and voted upon.
And then that had to be approved by the people in New Mexico, or the proposed state of New Mexico. And so let me ask you this. Again, this is around and after the Civil War. Were there other political considerations going on at the time that may have impacted as to whether or not they could get approval for statehood for New Mexico?
Oh, there were. The primary reason why statehood never actually occurred until 1912 was because in the eyes of the people on the East Coast, north and south, they simply thought that there were too many Hispanic people in New Mexico, and the prevailing idea in the 1800s was that Hispanic people were not capable of becoming citizens.
Okay.
Which nowadays seems absolutely shocking, but there's a historical context to why they felt that way, which also explains things like the relations between the United States and the Native Americans, is that there wasn't an idea, in the 1800s, there were very few people who believed in the idea of cultural relativity, that all cultures were equally interesting and unique and deserving of respect.
Mm-hmm.
The prevailing idea of politicians in the 1800s was that the only people who should be citizens with full rights and responsibilities and abilities to govern themselves through political position were people descended from the original colonists.
Okay.
And that's why there's a lot of political fighting over issues like immigration in the 1800s, and that's why groups like the Know Nothings, the anti-immigration party, came about in the 1850s. And that's partly why there was so much debate that almost came to violence in the House of Representatives over the war with Mexico itself in 1846. Because the people, especially the Whigs, the Whig Party, they were quite alarmed at the idea of going to war with Mexico because they knew that the United States would annex a lot of territory from Mexico. They knew the United States would win. Everybody knew that. But that would mean adding tens of thousands of new citizens
Mm-hmm.
who weren't descendants from the original colonists of the 13 colonies.
Okay.
And because of that, they were opposed to annexing New Mexico. That ultimately New Mexico was annexed. They were opposed to statehood on the grounds that since most of the people in New Mexico were of Hispanic origins, they felt that statehood was not a good idea, and that's in part why they proposed the joint New Mexico-Arizona state.
Okay. Arizona's population makeup a little different, I guess?
Yes. It was a much smaller territory, but Arizona was mostly Anglo-American residents, whereas New Mexico throughout this entire time was mostly people who were descended from the original colonists of New Mexico.
Which were the Spanish.
Yes, although that's also an interesting thing in and of itself. New Mexico, of course, the Spanish showed up in the early 1600s, but over the course of a few hundred years, a lot of the racial divisions and castes that the Spanish had operated using in the Spanish colonies, they sort of faded away, and New Mexico operated more on a class system based upon just economic status, like how much land someone owned, how many sheep and horses they had, how big their house was, how many servants and slaves they owned, their general wealth, how much money they had, how much property they had, things like that. That's how New Mexico sort of divided itself.
So were there, by the time it gets into the early 1900s and we're getting ready for the vote, were there people in Congress that brought this forward, that were really advocating for this, and were there people in Congress that were still opposed to this?
Oh, yes, there were still people quite opposed to it, just as there were people who were, supportive of it, and a lot of it, too, boiled down to politics and political parties, because, of course, it was Teddy Roosevelt's idea, and the governor of New Mexico, the territorial governor, was a fellow Republican. I believe the territorial representative was a Republican. And and when you see the breakdown like that, you see that a lot of the efforts at becoming a state depended on political party. And in fact, the reason why the Constitution failed in 1890 was in part because it was strongly pushed by the Republican Party and the Santa Fe Ring, which was Republican. The Democrats in the New Mexico Territory were opposed to it. But interestingly enough, another factor in 1890 was that the proposed state constitution included public schools, and the Catholic Church was really opposed to public schools, so they pushed for convincing their parishioners to vote against it.
Interesting. That there would be those types of divisions. Now, were there any other states or territories that were up for consideration, and so they said, well, we'll do New Mexico, but we're also going to do this territory over here, or was it pretty much just kind of on its own track this whole time?
Oh, it was on its own track the entire time, except for in 1906 when they tried to do a joint with Arizona.
Right.
But throughout this entire process, it was always the New Mexico territorial governor and the New Mexico territorial representative who were constantly, every year, submitting requests to Congress asking for statehood. So there was active lobbying. It's just that it was never joined with any other state or territory except in 1906.
Okay. So when New Mexico finally becomes a state, were there any official ceremonies? Did the president come to New Mexico, hand over the keys, if you will, or did it just kind of quietly happen and today we're a state?
Oh, it wasn't quiet. There were celebrations, and it was. I believe the president came over. I know that the president on multiple occasions came over just as part of campaigning. New Mexico was along the east-west coast rail lines. But it was a pretty big occasion for New Mexico after 62 years finally gaining statehood.
Right. So there were, I'm sure, some big celebrations and some official ceremonies and proclamations and all that good stuff. Did the territorial governor, was that person appointed as the first governor, or did they have elections right away to do that?
Oh, they, as part of voting on the state constitution, they also elected the first elected governor, because territorial governors are, of course, always appointed by the president.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the last territorial governor was William J. Mills, a Republican who was appointed by the Republican President William Taft.
Okay.
But the first elected governor of New Mexico, William Calhoun McDonald, was a Democrat.
Okay.
Which is interesting that in a state so thoroughly dominated by the Republican Party, because of the presidential nominations or our presidential appointments, that the very first elected official was a Democrat.
Now, when New Mexico came in, they would have had 2 senators and just 1 House of Representative member?
Yes.
Okay. Not enough population to add the 2nd or 3rd districts, so... but they would have been entered into Congress, 2 senators, as every state has 2 senators, and population granted 1 member of the House of Representatives. So,
yes, after many years of having a non-voting delegate who simply showed up and tried to lobby behind the scenes,
they made it there.
Interesting.
Well, Michael, we've got about a minute left. Anything else you'd like to share, or anything coming up at the museum you'd like to remind folks about?
Well, the Fashionable Founding Fathers exhibit ends this week. In fact, it's officially the last day is tomorrow, but it's not going to be dismantled until next week, so you can stop by and see it on Saturday.
Okay.
And you can see it 10 to 1 and 2 to 4 Tuesday through Saturday. And be sure to stop by the Ward House first before coming over to the Art Center.
Okay. And then you're working on your fall exhibits, I'm sure?
Yes, and if you want to see the museum's exhibit schedule, what you can do is you can go to artesianm.gov/museum, and then on the left-hand side, you'll see museum event schedule, and you can click on that, and you can see when the next exhibits will open.
Okay. So that's, I think you said cityofartesianm.gov?
Oh, it's just artesianm.
artesianm.gov/museum.
Yes.
And I'll take you right there. Excellent. Well, Michael, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for sharing with us the background of New Mexico finally becoming a state, and we'll look forward to what you have for us next week.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's it for the show today. We're going to turn it over to Clay and Buck. I'm sure they'll have